Hello, Darthvegan here, back with another episode of Kerbal Space Program, the tutorial. In this episode, we're going to be talking about taking your first ship into orbit. And so, there's a few things you need to do in order to get a ship into orbit. You need to have enough DeltaV to break away from Kerbin's gravity and achieve an orbital circumference around the planet's atmosphere. And you need to do that at a height greater than 70,000 meters. So in order to do that, it takes around 35 to 3,800 DeltaV, depending on how efficient you do your launch. So assuming you're just playing this for the first few times, you're probably not the most efficient at getting into orbit. So I would say plan for at least 3,800 to 4,000 to get you into orbit. So what we're going to do is, using our basic rocket that we have, I think you should be able to get into orbit with just these first two, basic rocketry and engineering 101. With these two, you should be able to achieve an orbit, and you should be able to successfully and safely re-enter that orbit. So I went ahead and started a rocket, but we're just going to build another one from scratch. So the first thing you need, obviously, is a command pod. I would use it over the re-entry module, as the command pod probably is a little better, just due to the re-entry module does not have a reaction wheel, whereas the command pod does have reaction wheel, so it allows you to move around a little bit better. And it does this one have an ablator at all? This one does not have an ablator. So an ablator is basically a heat shield. And we don't have a heat shield researched, so that could be a little bit of a problem. So we're going to try it without having an ablator. We'll try it with just the command pod. Hopefully we don't burn up in re-entry. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in our command pod here. We're going to put on a parachute on top, just like that. And we are going to need some fuel, but in order to successfully re-enter, we need to be able to dump all of our rockets and fuel. And so we need a decoupler here that we unlocked with Engineering 101, and that will allow us to remove all of our rocketry parts and just re-enter with just this command module. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in a few of these bad boys here, and I'm just holding down Alt and left clicking, and then I'm repeating here. So we're going to put on I think about 8 of these. Let's see what that gives us. With 8, that would give us 3,000 DeltaV. So we're not quite enough to get into orbit. So let's get another 4 and see what we'll get there. 3,500. Oh, that's cutting it close. The problem is we don't want to add too much more fuel, or our DeltaV will not increase because we don't have enough thrust to launch it. 3746. That should get us into orbit. Alright, so we're going to go with that. I'm going to put on 4 fins, so hopefully we don't flop around too much. Alright, and so this is a pretty simple basic rocket with the most basic of parts. I would go ahead and put on some science on here, so that whenever you get into orbit, you can do some science. But I would actually put on more than one, because you'll be doing science in orbit, you'll be doing science high over Kerbin. There's several different science opportunities. So I put 2, if this is your first time into orbit, I'd put 2 or 3 on there, and maybe put 2 of the mystery gears on there as well. You don't need to put on the engineering part, because we turned that off in the first tutorial. So if you haven't watched the first tutorial on building your first rocket, you can do that now. I guess maybe it's the second tutorial. I don't know. But anyway, it's how to build your first rocket. We talk about turning off the need to add these parts. But it is good to know. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and save this as DVS tutorial 2. I'm going to save it. Yep, I'm going to overwrite my last one. And then we're going to try to launch this thing. Now our staging is all set up. We have our rocket to boost. We have our separator to dump everything. And then we have our parachute very last. And adding on these mystery gears, I dropped a little bit below, down to 3651. So let's see if we can add one more fuel pod on there. 3746. Okay. There's a tipping point where you get to where if you add more fuel, you get less DeltaV because of the weight. Anyway, we're at our maximum parts anyway. I have 30 parts, so we can't add any more parts anyway. So we're going to go ahead and launch. And the way you add more parts is by upgrading your vehicle assembly building. Alright, so once you're on your launch pad, there's a few things you want to do. You want to press T for turn on your SAS, and then you want to throttle all the way up to your maximum throttle for your rocket, at least on your first few rockets anyway. And then what we're going to do is we're going to fly up until we reach about, I usually do 100, but for starters, that's pretty aggressive. So, well, when you get around 250 meters per second, we'll start angling out towards 90 degrees. And what that does is it allows us to go with, if you look at Kerbal here, it rotates counterclockwise. So if we launch towards 90 degrees, that will allow us to come off the airfield here, come off the Space Center, and then follow the trajectory of the orbiting planet. Thus, we allow the inertia from the planet to help launch us. I don't know how much DeltaV that saves us, but it does save us a considerable amount, especially when you're first starting. So you always want to go with the rotation of the planet, at least at first. Alright, so let's go ahead and get ready to launch. I have my flight engineer over here open to my vessel tab, so I can keep a check on my thrust to weight ratio and some of my DeltaV and other things. And of course I've got my DeltaV up here, as well as my apoapsis height. And we'll take a look at what that apoapsis height looks like as we launch. So we're going to go ahead and launch the rocket by pressing spacebar. So away we go, and we're going to keep our vector here in the center of the retrograde vector. That means we're going to point our rocket in the direction of our flight, and we are going to do that until we get to about 250 meters per second, and then we'll start angling out towards the 90 degrees very slowly, not aggressively at all, because if you start getting too aggressive while you're in this heavy atmosphere, the aerodynamics of the pressure will make your rocket flip and turn around and do all kinds of crazy stuff. So we'll start tipping out very gently. Don't break the circle of the retrograde vector. You can get it right on the edge of it, but try not to be too aggressive as you go out towards the 90 degrees, at least at first, because you can see air dragging on the rocket as we're punching through this thick atmosphere. But now as we're getting a little bit higher, we can be a little more aggressive and start angling out towards 90 degrees. You can see our apoapsis is up to 34,000. That means if we continue on our trajectory, this is how high we will be at the top of our flight. So now that we're out of the atmosphere, I'm going to be a lot more aggressive with my angling, and we're going to wait till we get about 73, 74, 76. Now we're going to kill our engines, and we're going to drift up we'll lose a little bit of our altitude because we're slowing down as we drift up, but I want to get my time to apoapsis here. If we go into the map mode, you can see that we've got a nice little angle coming up here. What you want to do is you want to get up to your apoapsis, and you want to burn again so that you're flying horizontal to the surface of the planet. And what that does is it flattens out this curve so that this circle will eventually encompass the entire planet. So it's a pretty tricky maneuver if you've never done it before, but once you get the hang of it, it's really not too bad. Again, probably with this rocket, we'll start at about 30 seconds left for our time to apoapsis, and then we'll do our burn. Now, this is a good time to talk about time skipping. You have your comma and your period, which are also the greater than and less than arrow keys. If you press them, you can speed up time and slow down time. And then if you press the slash question mark key, at least that's what it is on my keyboard, it will kill any time warping that you've done already. So now we're about 20 seconds to our apoapsis, I'm going to go ahead and start burning again. Make sure I'm pointing at prograde. Now you can see my apoapsis time is increasing. That means my apoapsis is going away from me. So I'm going to go ahead and kill it so that it don't get too far away from me. Otherwise, I'm just going higher instead of focusing on going horizontal. So I'm going to get my vector towards the horizon here. And then once we get about 10 seconds this time, I'm going to go ahead and kick in full thrust. And we'll see if we can get our curve flattened out here. So go ahead and hit Z to kick into full thrust. You can see our arc is flattening out, which is good. And we're running out of fuel. I don't know if we'll have quite enough fuel. Oh, it's going to be close. It's going to be close. You can see my periapsis height is dropping down, so it should be about... oh, we ran out of fuel before we got there. Darn. Alright, so... my flight wasn't efficient enough, and I was unable to achieve a nice orbit. We were almost there. Almost there. Alright, so we're going to add another fuel tank and see if that still gives us enough DeltaV. There's also another way we could do this. We could put in another... This is how they do it in real life. They would put on another stage here. Oops. In the rocket. Put on a stage here. So that we don't carry all that weight with us through the entire launch. So if we get our second decoupler here, and our second rocket, that gives us 3932 DeltaV, even though we added weight, and now we're over the part limit. So we need to take off some of these parts. Let's go ahead and get rid of the Mr. Goo for the purpose of this demonstration. There we go. And we now have a much more efficient rocket because we will spend all this fuel, we'll dump all this extra weight, and then we will use this to get on into orbit here. Actually, we could probably rearrange these fuel canisters to maybe spin more of them down here, but I think this will be just fine. So let's go ahead and launch this rocket. But that's just showing you how close you can get to an orbit with just a very, very basic rocket. All right, so this is a little more advanced rocket, but I think this was a perfect demonstration on how to build a rocket appropriately using decouplers. So we're going to go ahead and launch with Jebediah one more time, and got our throttle all the way up, and then we're going to go ahead and get our launch vector going. Well, again, once we get to around 250 or so meters per second, we'll start angling, and we'll be a little more aggressive than we were last time. I think we wasted a little bit of fuel last time going up instead of angling out towards 90, but I wanted to try to play it safe for the tutorial. I played it a little too safe and wasted some fuel. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start angling out about 100 or so. That's what I normally do. I was trying to be a little less aggressive for the tutorial. Oh, you can see there's quite a bit of wobbling here. That's because none of these things have struts on them. So what we don't want is a nice wobbly rocket. Because it might fall apart. That is something I need to show you here after this flight, is how to add structural supports to this thing here. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and start angling out a little bit. And I'm going to drop our first stage here momentarily. Get ready to drop the first stage, and when we press spacebar, it not only launches our second rocket, but it also drops the first one off, and so it's a kind of a two-part maneuver there. So that's always good. So now our rocket is much lighter. Our thrust-to-weight ratio is really high, and we can really use our thrust to get into a good position. All right, so we're going to go ahead and pop up here, and now would actually be a good time to do a little science if you wanted to. If you haven't done it yet, you would just keep your experiments, and then you can send them down to Earth, or you can keep them and usually get more science by keeping the science rather than sending them down through radio. But we're going to wait till our apoapsis gets up close to 30 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up time until we get to about 30 seconds before the apoapsis. I recommend going into map view while you're still learning, just to get a good idea of how it works. Alright, so then I'm going to go ahead and hit Z to flatten out my angle again. Again, it's starting to run away from me is what I call it. So I'm going to kill my engines. And I'm going to wait till we get to 30 seconds again, or maybe a little lower this time. We'll go about 20 seconds. And what I like about the engineering mod is that it shows our horizontal speed versus our vertical speed. So you want to have a horizontal speed of around 2,500 in order to get into orbit. So that's the idea there. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and start inching up here. Let's see if we can get our... Yeah. Let's get all the way up. Let's get our orbit flattened out here. Oh, it's going to be close, but we're going to do it. Alright, so as soon as the periapsis reaches the same height as the apoapsis, it will flip around so that the periapsis is now where you're at, and your apoapsis will start going away from you, because the apoapsis is the height of the top of your curve, whereas the periapsis is the lowest point. So if you keep burning, your lowest point will soon be where you're at, and your highest point will be wherever you stop burning. So now we've achieved an orbit. We are floating in space, and we can't do an EVA because we haven't researched it yet. But at some point you can do an EVA where your Kerbonaut can exit the vehicle and do additional science experiments, and then you can also get some science from inside of orbit. And so now that you are in an orbit, you will basically stay in this orbit forever. So you can speed up time, and you will just sit there and spin around the planet over and over and over and over and over. And your Kerbals don't have to eat or drink, so they won't die. They can stay out in space indefinitely. So now is a good time to go to the tracking station and let you see what that's all about. So you can see the tracking station now keeps track of our ship, the Tutorial 2. You can see we've been orbiting Kerbin. Our mission time has been 5 minutes. So, and you can click on it and you can see the orbit around the planet. And then you can see some missions that we have here that it's given us to do various things. And then you can click on fly, and we'll go back to our vessel. So now that we've achieved an orbit, the question is, how do we get back to Kerbin? How do we get back home? Well, you want to, in order to get back home, you need to slow your rocket down so that it is no longer fast enough to maintain an orbit around the planet. That's around 22 to 2,500 meters per second. I don't know the exact number, but we're going 2281, so it's less than 2,500. So typically what I do is I'll first determine where I want to land. Where do I want to land? And you want to land as close to the Kerbal Space Center as possible so that you can recover as much of your money, your funds from your existing parts. That being said, if you land on different parts of the planet, you can get new science from landing on different biomes, like the desert, the mountains, the ocean, those type of things. And the ocean is always safer to drop in because it's a little less, you have less to worry about. So what we're going to do is we're going to circle around the planet until we get to about right here, this little peninsula here. And then we're going to reduce our speed so that we try to land at or near the Space Center. So what we're going to do is we're going to let our ship float around. We got our 4 times time warp here. And as soon as we get to this peninsula here, I'm going to hit the /? key to kill my time warp. And then kill it now. And then I'm going to point my ship to retrograde. So this is the prograde vector. That means we're going in the direction of our flight. And the retrograde is the opposite direction of our flight. So if we get our ship pointed at the retrograde marker, and this gets easier once you get more experienced pilots because you can have them automatically select those things. We will now be able to thrust, and we will be going slower because we're thrusting opposite the direction of our flight. Now, I didn't have very much fuel left, so I actually just got my periapsis down to 13,000. So if we look here, the periapsis is still above the surface of the planet. So I'm actually not going to land anywhere near the Space Center. But we're going to go ahead and drop our... Actually, we're going to leave this on here for just a few minutes to let it take some of the brunt of the heat of our re-entry here. So as we go lower, because I slowed down, we're going to start hitting the atmosphere soon. And we want to stay pointing retrograde so that the bottom of our ship accepts the heat of our re-entry here. And the engines are actually pretty durable. They can withstand a lot of heat, but you just want to be careful that you don't overdo it with the heat. Otherwise, your ship will explode. But we do have a decoupler here that we're going to dump out, and hopefully this crew module can withstand a little bit of heat. I typically would not recommend doing this, but I wanted to show you that you can make an orbital craft with just very, very basic science unlocked. Now, you probably actually would want to leave this ship in orbit and rescue them at some other time rather than risk a re-entry without a heat shield, but I think we can do okay. And I wanted to tell you while we're flying that F5 is quick save, and I recommend doing a quick save anytime you're doing any kind of re-entry or anything risky like a landing on another planetary body or anything like that, because then you can reload it right before the incident happens and you can try to do something different. That's just a quick little tip that I use quick save all the time, and sometimes I edit them out of my videos, sometimes I don't, but I use it all the time because Kerbal, things just go wrong sometimes. And you spend too much time invested in some of these missions to just let some crazy thing happening ruining all your plans. So anyway, so we're letting this guy take all the heat, and if he starts overheating, he'll get a little bar here showing his heat meter, but as you can see, he's accepting the heat so far. And one thing you can do to reduce heat flow is you can spin using the Q and the E, but it's a little dangerous spinning too much if you don't have good control over your ship with a low-level pilot, because you have to do all the manual controls, so you have to kind of be careful not to spin out of control. So I'm just lightly tapping the ASD, sometimes W as well, just to keep my ship pointed towards retrograde. And you can see we're coming in on the dark side of the planet, so we missed the Space Center because I didn't have enough fuel to stop myself in time. But we're coming in okay. We're slowing down, not very much, but a little bit, and we're using the atmosphere to slow ourselves down. And so you can see our altitude's dropping steadily. Our speed's not dropping that quickly, but we're burning off a lot of this velocity just here in the atmosphere, and it'll take longer to do it this way, but it's a lot safer to do it this way because you don't have as much heat buildup by hitting that thick atmosphere. We're still in the very thin part of the atmosphere, and so while we do have a lot of flame and it looks cool, we actually don't have as much heat as we would if we were coming in on the thicker parts of the atmosphere. Now you can see we're starting to build up a little bit of heat on our engine here, so you can see this heat meter is easy. It's starting to build up a little bit, especially if I'm not staying right on the retrograde marker. So you want to just keep an eye on that. Don't let it explode. If it's going to explode, you need to go ahead and detach. But you can see we're starting to get into the thicker atmosphere, so it's getting ready to blow up. So I'm going to do a little spin, see if I can keep a little bit of this thing alive. It's getting tougher. It's getting tougher. We're coming in pretty hot and heavy. I'm probably going to go ahead and drop it here pretty soon. It's getting hard to control. It's getting hot, and I don't want it to blow up and destroy our Kerbal. So we're going to keep at it. It's getting tougher. It's getting tough to hold into position here. It's overheating. It's doing okay. We're getting slower. We're doing good. Let's just keep at it. Let's just keep at it. It's a tense moment, your first re-entry without a heat shield. Eesh. I'm really struggling to keep the ship pointing in the right direction. Aerodynamically, it's not very sound. So it wants to spin around so that the bullet shape of the crew module is in the front. But I'm really struggling to keep it into position. I think we're going to be able to do it. Alright. We're really losing speed now because we're hitting a thicker atmosphere. And we're soon going to be in a safe velocity. We can detach this and go ahead and let our crew module float down. Oh yeah. You know, under 1,000 meters per second, you typically start losing the flame. And so we're going to go ahead and detach. Alright, so that thing's going to fall to the ground separately and crash. And then we're going to wait till about 350 or so. We're going to go ahead and shoot our chutes out, let it start slowing us down. And we should land somewhere either in the ocean or right here on this little peninsula. So if we look on the planet here, we're on the very far side of the planet. And we're safe. We're good. We're going to go ahead and speed up time. And that is your first orbit and re-entry. You made it. You're safe. If you didn't make it, that's fine. Go ahead and hit that reload button. Just hit escape, load save, load from your quick save here, and keep trying it. And it's a little tricky without a heat shield. We can make a little better rocket once we get some science and add on a heat shield. And I'll go ahead and speed up time until this thing pops its chute and we drift down to the ocean. And then once we get down to the ocean, we just recover our vehicle and we've made it safe and sound. So I think we went ahead and used all of our science, so we won't be able to get science from the ocean. But if we send that, we don't have an antenna on here. Alright, so we splashed down in the water. Can't do an EVA. Oh yeah, we can. But we can do an EVA report, get a little extra science in there. And jump back in, and now recover our vessel. And you will see that we will get our our mission debriefing. Alright, so we got 32.9 science from that, so that's great. We got 1,626 funds from our recovered parts, that's great. Jebediah leveled up to level 1 because he has now done an orbit of Kerbal, so that's great. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial for achieving your first orbit. Obviously, to make a more efficient re-entry, you will want to use more efficient parts, namely the survivability, which is 15 science. It will give you these heat shields, so we'll go ahead and research that right quick just so I can show you ideally what you would do with your re-entry module. We'll go ahead and load the same ship that we loaded last time, but the only addition that we're going to make to this is we're going to put, before the decoupler, we'll put on the 1.25 heat shield, and that will just allow us to get to not be as scared to allow this command pod to do all of the re-entry, and you won't have to maintain the rocket for the purposes of a heat shield. Basically, you can allow the actual heat shield to take all the heat, and you can maybe be a little more selective on how you land and where you land. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, press that like button. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see another type of tutorial, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.